Everybody. All right, so today we're talking through the first short stories that we have assigned for the course. So remember, you also have these two chapters from the secondary text, Cambridge Companion to Crime Fiction, which are going to give you some historical context and some larger background on this moment from the mid to late 19th century where the detective tale becomes a popularized form. If you have trouble with these links, so that book is available through the library website, but if you have trouble with those links for whatever reason, I posted a full PDF version of it here, so you can just use that instead. So let's start with Poe, and then we will jump into talking about Sherlock Holmes. So The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published by American writer Poe, who some of you probably read back in high school or middle school, known mostly for writing very sometimes creepy, gothic, or sometimes supernatural tales, right? Often dealing with themes about death or murder or crime. But this, of course, unlike some of his other stories, which do have kind of a supernatural theme, this one deals wholly with the world of the rational, right? The things that can be explained in the same way that Holmes does. So you want to be thinking about similarities between the two stories and how you might see the stories evolve over time from 1841, when this was published, to then 1891, when Scandal in Bohemia is published. So how has the form become more modernized? How has Doyle developed it? And maybe you might think improved upon it, but how has it changed? Okay, so when we start this story, my guess is a lot of us were turned off or confused by this very long opening about games, right? And sort of the mental capacity that it takes to play these different kinds of games that were popular at the time, which one is superior, which one is inferior. So I'm just going to leave that there as a question for you, right? So why does he spend so much time talking about this? Why is this how he begins, as opposed to just getting right to the meat of the story, which is, of course, about the murders and the central mystery? One similarity that you would have noticed is, of course, that we have a narrator kind of filtering the action, right? So in Holmes, this is always Dr. Watson, but in this story, we have a narrator who bonds with Dupin over being similarly educated, similarly bookish, right? They seem to both be high or upper class. So you might think about, one, why this narrator has to exist. Why can't Dupin just tell the story? And also, how is class background important, right? So both Holmes and Dupin are kind of gentlemen of leisure, right? We hear Dupin's kind of fallen on hard times, right? But he has a fancy family background, right? So class seems to be very important to this category and our identity of this gentleman detective. So what's the importance of that? What does it tell us about the British and American conceptualization of this detective figure at this time? And is that maybe something that's going to change throughout the course? Now, in terms of some historical context, you'll notice that both stories, of course, take place in cities, right? We have Paris and then we have London. If you're thinking about the time period, right, so mid to late 19th century, we have rise of urbanization, rise of industrialization, so the growth of cities. And this, particularly for England, which had a very, and still does, has a very stratified class system, this came with some anxiety, right? Because now, instead of having this sort of neat social organization where everybody's separate and you know who everybody is, now we have this city which is more anonymous, right? And there's this fear that some of those social categories or categorizations are going to erode. So if you think about the way that Holmes is able to put on all these disguises, and Watson says essentially that he becomes those people, right? That he changes not only his dress, but his expression and his manner and his soul. There is this kind of fear that, social categorizations are going to dissolve in the city, right? And that the world becomes more confusing and more jumbled up, which I think was certainly anxiety producing. We also, of course, can think about this as late 19th century, the time of Jack the Ripper in London, the moment in which people are starting to realize, as if they didn't know this before, right, that we can pretend that society is sort of orderly and controllable, but there are these darker aspects of human nature, human capacity that just can't be ignored, regardless of how rational you think your society is. So there is certainly a fear of crime in the city, this fear of eroding social classifications. And so you might think about how the detective figure works against that, and how the detective figure might be comforting to our readers, right? Because they're able to impose social order, right? This is something I mentioned in some of the discussions about justice and knowledge, right, with the detective novel. So the detective figure is able to kind of right the things that have gone wrong, right, impose justice. The world seems out of control, but then Dupin is going to figure out everything that went awry, and then it will be, made right by the end of the story. So beyond that, the final thing that I'll say about Poe is this idea about who the real culprit is at the end of the story. So we know that unlike a lot of the stories that we'll read moving forward, which will be dealing with questions of human psychology and crime, my guess is a lot of us who haven't read this before didn't anticipate the fact that the real culprit was going to be an animal. So the first thing you can think about there is the idea that a lot of these early detective stories don't really allow us to participate in the solving of the mystery, and that's something that's going to change, right? So when you read a really modern mystery novel, part of the thing that people enjoy about it, and this might work for film too, is the idea that you might be able to solve it before the characters do. That's not really true here, right? So we're not really given a lot of facts that would allow us to figure it out. It makes sense that he figures it out, right? But it's not really something that we're participating in. So it maybe makes him seem more impressive, right? That he's able to figure this all out. The entire final part of the story, before the sailor sort of takes over, is just Dupin explaining things to us, right, for a very long time. And there's moments where Holmes will do kind of that same thing. So be thinking again about sort of the detective as this comforting figure, and the comfort that might come for readers at this time with the idea that the real culprit in this story was an animal, right? There's this terrible, horrific crime that everyone is so disturbed by, but it turns out that a human being didn't commit it at all, which would have been comforting, right? This idea that maybe a human being couldn't have been capable of it, that only an animal could have done it. Now, we see that, of course, as naive, right? But that would certainly be again, I use the word comforting, right? A comforting realization, or, something that would allow readers to feel again like the world has been righted by the time the world has been fixed, the world is controlled and safe again by the time they finish reading the story. All right. So now if we move over into Holmes, so if you want to do the optional activity, which I had left here for you, if you're interested, throughout the week, if you're looking for something to watch that'll help you kind of expand your views on the topic, the BBC Sherlock adaptation, which is set in the modern day, does have a version of this story, The Scandal in Bohemia. It's called The Scandal in Belgravia, so it's slightly changed, but it could be really interesting to check out the differences and how the story has been altered. For this text, you want to be thinking, one, about some of those same ideas, right? Questions of disguise, about the urban location in the city, about the class system, about the relationship between the narrator and Holmes himself, right? So Watson as kind of the medium that controls the narrative, right? That filters Holmes's more complex view of the world, or maybe, just different view of the world into a frame that we can understand and relate to. But then also be thinking about gender in this story, right? So we get one of the really only instances in Holmes, or in a Holmes story. Of course, there's, various, trials that Holmes goes through and various villains. Moriarty is a big one, right? But Holmes gets beaten in this story, right? He does not accomplish his goal. He is outsmarted. And you'll see a lot of reference to the fact, that this is, a woman adversary, right, who defeats him in the end. So much so that he has to now admit that she kind of goes beyond what he's believed women were capable of previously, and he just refers to her as the woman, right? So like she has eclipsed all other women forever. So be thinking about gender, the way it works in the story. She, of course, also is able to put on disguises and change in the same way that he is. We do get a reference to photography as well, which would have been a really, modern technology in this moment of time, had not been around for very long. And the way that then that gets connected with ideas about evidence or proof, that's certainly something that we'll see in other stories as we go through. So just for the rest of your time here for Thursday's course, you're going to want to go into the discussion post and respond to the questions. There's certainly a lot more to say about this story, but I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing your ideas about both texts in the discussion board. All right, so thanks so much, guys.